before we dive into academic achievement and growth data, that we only have the MCA to use as a point on this for this metric, and the MCA, by all accounts, is a flawed and biased test. We only give it one time per year. Teachers don't even have a chance to respond to the results of the MCA, but it's that metric that we see all over the newspapers that tells us our schools are failing. So because MPS is using it, I'm using it too, and I'm just looking at it. I want to couch it in the fact that this is not the only factor that matters in why families choose a particular school.
MCA reading, middle school proficiency and growth. This study of 16 different school districts found that although there was a general loss of achievement as students transitioned to high school, students from K-8 schools had lower rates of achievement loss than students from traditional middle schools. Ultimately, the study's authors concluded that students placed in relatively small cohort groups for long spans of time tend to experience more desirable educational outcomes.
So MPS shared this particular slide in one of their early presentations on the boundary study, and I took a look at it and I thought, the K-8 schools actually look like they're above the mean more than the middle schools are above the mean. What's going on here? And it was pointed out to me that students' information from grades 3 to 5 in the K-8s would be included in this aggregate data. So even though we can almost perfectly predict MCA scores in a building by knowing the free and reduced price lunch level in a building, I wanted to delve a little bit more closely into actual middle school information on that. So I dove into that report card and I pulled out just data for grades 6, 7, and 8. And we see, again, just like the slide that MPS shared, that reading achievement data is very, very closely tied to free and reduced price lunch levels in a building. But I decided to go a little further, because if you can predict what a building does, is it actually telling you what the kids in the building are doing. So I wanted to look at what was happening for kids who are not receiving free and reduced price lunch and for kids who are. And what we do see here is that mostly the kids not receiving free and reduced price lunch do fine. They just overall do fine. They're kind of in that 60 to 70% number of kids hitting those achievement goals. What we see here, though, looking more closely at this bottom part, is that kids who are receiving free and reduced price level, their achievement scores are much less predictable. You'd think that should mirror, like if there's a lot of wealth in a school as a whole, then the poorest kids in that school should also do well or do better than the mean. And that's not really true. There's outliers all over this. The correlation's not very high. There's a couple standouts and outliers, but still it's not as predictable as you'd think. But I will point out that overall, if you do the actual math on these numbers, the K-8 community schools do a little bit better and the middle schools do a little bit worse, but that difference is actually not super significant. So the other thing I was looking at, because free and reduced price lunch levels, but also special ed levels and ELL levels in a building are how we budget. I wondered how that affected, if we took those things into account, how does that actually affect the achievement numbers that we see? So I did a regression with the budget, and I figured out kind of a formula to call a stress metric, which includes those 3 factors. So if we kind of look at that same achievement information again as a function of that stress metric, which I've continued to use throughout all of this after this point, we see that the outliers actually, Justice Page actually does great on most things. And then Anderson, which doesn't have really great overall achievement numbers, does really, really great in almost all of our metrics when we're looking at these numbers based on the poverty and ELL levels in their building. And we see that 3 of the middle schools actually do significantly worse. And then I broke it out because a lot of this conversation is centered around white students versus students of color. So I did break it out that way as well. And again, we see that in most cases, in all of the middle schools, that's this top area here, the white students are doing fine. They're mostly above the 70% achievement level. At Northeast and Franklin, they're actually not. I'm not sure why, but it's a little different for students of color. And we see then that Justice Page is the only middle school that is an outlier in this data, and we now have 2 community schools that are actually doing better for students of color, and we have 3 middle schools that aren't. And those, anytime you see a box around something, it means it was outside of a standard deviation, so it's significant. So, kind of overall conclusion, we can say students of color do have slightly better reading proficiency in K-8 schools. There was no other significant differences in reading proficiency after adjusting for poverty or other stress factors. So MPS is right in asserting there are still gaps. There are in every single building that we have in this district, and that is independent of model, but the K-8 schools are doing slightly better. And then I decided to look at growth, because no matter where you are in MPS and no matter where you start, you should always be able to grow. Every student should have the opportunity to grow every day in every building. That's, I think, a fundamental belief of teachers and parents and everyone who ever works with kids. So, as I suspected, there's actually no correlation to our stress metric for that. And so drawing a straight line, half above, half below, you'll see that there is, again, only 1 middle school above the mean when we look at growth numbers for students of color. All the rest are, actually all the community K-8s and a couple of the magnets fall above the midline. So, back to our checklist. Free and reduced lunch students and students of color have significantly higher reading growth in K-8 schools.